Sarah and Sandra had been inseparable for years, their friendship forged in the warmth of shared secrets and dreams. They met in university, and even after life took them to different corners of the world, they stayed close. Now both lived in Abuja, each settled into adulthood in their own ways. Sarah, still single, admired Sandra's life, particularly her handsome, successful husband, Chris. At first, it was subtle. Sarah would compliment Sandra about how lucky she was, making light jokes about wishing she had a man like Chris. But over time, the admiration turned into something darker. Sarah wanted Chris for herself. She envied the way Sandra and Chris seemed so effortlessly happy. The more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that she could be the one making him happy. Sarah wasn't willing to wait for love to find her anymore. One evening, Sarah invited Sandra over to her apartment, under the guise of needing advice about her job. The two women sat in the living room, sipping on wine. Sarah had been planning this moment for weeks, choosing the perfect time and way to execute her twisted plan. She was going to make sure that Sandra was out of the way, permanently. As the evening wore on, Sarah proposed a toast. To old friends, she smiled, watching as Sandra raised her glass and took a long sip. What Sandra didn't know was that Sarah had laced her drink with a poison that would act swiftly, leaving little time for her to even realize what was happening. Sandra began to feel dizzy, clutching her throat as the world around her blurred. "Sarah," she whispered, confused and afraid. "It's okay," Sarah said coldly, "it will be over soon." Within minutes, Sandra collapsed onto the floor, her body limp and lifeless. Sarah calmly set down her glass, already rehearsing the next part of her plan in her mind. She would feign innocence, telling Chris that Sandra had simply left to run errands and never came back. In time, she would comfort Chris in his grief. Slowly working her way into his life, for months, Sarah played the role of the supportive friend, helping Chris through his heartbreak, always there to lend a shoulder. Chris, broken and vulnerable, never suspected the truth. Eventually, as Sarah hoped, he began to see her as more than a friend. One evening, they shared a quiet dinner at his house, and Chris admitted that he was finally ready to move on. He kissed her, and Sarah's heart raced. It had all worked perfectly. But fate has a way of catching up with even the most careful of planners. Weeks after Sandra's mysterious disappearance, a routine investigation by the police into missing persons uncovered the toxicology reports from Sandra's last visit to the hospital. It wasn't long before the detectives came knocking on Sarah's door. As Sarah stood in her doorway, facing the police, her carefully constructed world began to crumble. She had gotten what she wanted, but at a cost she hadn't anticipated. Now, the only future awaiting her was behind bars.